Wake up, people! The 4 biggest banks are Chinese. The title's a bit of a clickbait, I know. Even if anything anybody said about Nathan Rothschild was true, he lived almost 200 years ago. The 4 biggest banks in the world are Chinese. Many of the richest companies in the world are Chinese, too, not Jewish. Also, until June 2019, China was the country that America was indebted in the most. In June 2019, Japan bought off many of those debts. In the early days of communism, many communists hated banks. In those days, most communists were real working class people, not university students. They had a dislike of banks because they worked with their hands, because they themselves worked with their hands and bodies, while banks didn't produce food or something, I don't know, like that. I didn't mean to insult Nathan Rothschild, by the way. But now that my video is about banks somehow, you might ask, who was Nathan Rothschild? Nathan Rothschild was a man rumored to have become rich by unscrupulous methods. Some contemporaries apparently didn't like him. So, I'm translating the following with Google Translate because some of the words are complicated and because I'm lazy. The Napoleonic Wars, specifically the Duke of Wellington's Iberian campaign, gave Nathan Rothschild the opportunity to offer himself to the British government as a banker. By supplying Wellington with gold shipping to Portugal to enable Wellington with gold, shipping it to Portugal to enable Wellington to pay his soldiers their wages, and smuggling gold during the continental system, the effects of which were underestimated and therefore tolerated by the French, he became very rich and became the most influential British government sponsor. The story that Rothschild is said to have become the richest man in the world with bond transactions in 1815, because he was the first to know about Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, is today considered an anti-Semitic or anti-Rothschild legend that transports the stereotype of Jews as homeless war profiteers. Honore de Balzac was one of the first to publicly attack the Rothschilds. In his short story, The House of Nucingen, 1838, almost 200 years ago, the arrogant, ruthless, and coarse banker Nucingen, who acquires his wealth through fraudulent bankruptcies, is a caricature of Nathan Rothschild, of James Rothschild. The story that is still circulating today, that the Rothschild family acquired their wealth by speculating on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo, might come from this story. According to this, Nathan Rothschild, thanks to an inefficient spy agency, learned of the victorious outcome of the battle before the British government did, and then sold his shares to make other investors believe that he had information about a British defeat. Then there was panic selling and sharp price losses, which Nathan Rothschild used to buy up the securities cheaply. After the arrival of the victory message, he then benefited from an enormous price increase. George Darnell circulated this untrue story again in 1846 in his pamphlet The Edifying and Curious Story of Rothschild, the First King of the Jews. An anonymous contemporary described Nathan Rothschild at the London Stock Exchange as he leaned against the Rothschild pillar, hung his heavy hands into his pockets, and began to release silent, motionless, implacable cunning. Eyes, he said, he wrote, eyes are usually called the windows of the soul. But in Rothschild's case, you would conclude that the windows are false ones, or that there was no soul to look out for them. There comes not one pencil of light from the interior, neither is there one gleam of that which comes from without reflected in any direction. So, I hope I made you smarter today, and always remember, folks, the 4 biggest banks are Chinese, not Jewish.